In 1791, in a stone farmhouse in the village of Camembert, Normandy, France, a woman named Marie Harel created the most iconic cheese in French history. By 1983, the French government had protected it with one of the most powerful food laws in all of Europe. And then, step by step, compromise by compromise, France's own regulatory authorities spent the next 4 decades dismantling everything they had built, handing the most prestigious cheese designation in French history to the industrial corporations that had spent decades trying to acquire it. This is the exact story of how it happened, who was responsible, and why what France did to Camembert may be one of the most quietly catastrophic cultural mistakes of the modern era. The story begins during the most violent period France had ever lived through. It was 1791, the second year of the French Revolution, and the country was being dismantled at speed. Churches were being seized by the state, monasteries dissolved, and clergy who refused to swear loyalty to the new republic were being hunted down, imprisoned, and sent to the guillotine. In the small village of Camembert, in the Orne department of Lower Normandy, a 28-year-old farm woman named Marie Harel opened her door to a man who was fleeing for his life. Sheltering him was an act of genuine courage in a time when doing so could cost you everything. His name was Abbé Charles Jean Bonvoost, a Catholic priest originally from the Brie region, approximately 150 miles southeast of Camembert. He was what the Revolution called a refractory priest, a member of the clergy who had refused to swear the oath of allegiance to the Republic and who was now actively pursued by revolutionary authorities. Marie Harel sheltered him inside her farmhouse, keeping him hidden from soldiers who regularly passed through Normandy, searching for men exactly like him. In return for that protection, Abbé Bonvoost shared something he had carried from his home region, the specific cheese-making techniques used in Brie, a soft, bloomy rind cheese from the rich agricultural land around Paris. He had little else to offer a farm woman who had risked her life for a stranger, and what he gave her changed culinary history forever. Marie Harel combined those Brie techniques with the raw milk of her own Normand cows and the invisible natural microflora, the living organisms that existed only in the air, the wood, and the stone of her specific Normandy farmhouse. The result was something entirely new, a small, round, soft-ripened cheese with a white, velvety rind dusted with natural mold and a rich, earthy, mushroomy interior that nothing from the Brie region had ever quite replicated. She named it after her village, as tradition dictated, Camembert. Within a few years, it had spread across the local markets of Normandy, and farmers who tasted it understood immediately that what they were eating was something genuinely unlike anything they had ever known. For nearly half a century, Camembert remained a local secret. It was deeply loved in Normandy and traded at regional markets, but the world beyond the Orne department had never tasted it. That changed in 1855 at a railway station in Paris. Marie Harel's daughter, also named Marie, presented a basket of Camembert cheeses to Emperor Napoleon III at the Gare Montparnasse. The emperor tasted it, declared it extraordinary, and when the young woman told him the name, he is recorded as having kissed her on both cheeks, a gesture of imperial approval that sent demand from Paris into immediate and dramatic growth. The French court had discovered Camembert, and within months it was the most talked-about cheese in the French capital. But popularity immediately revealed Camembert's fatal weakness. It was an extremely fragile product. The soft, ripe cheese broke apart during transport, arriving at markets as an unrecognizable, collapsed mess. For decades, this limited meaningful distribution to areas where the cheese could be carried by hand or transported by horse cart over short distances. It was a regional treasure that the world could not have. Then, in 1890, an engineer named M. Ridel designed a solution so simple it seems almost inevitable in hindsight. A thin, circular wooden box made from bent poplar veneer, light and inexpensive, exactly the right diameter to hold a single round of camembert without applying pressure to the delicate rind. The Ridel box changed everything overnight. Camembert could now be stacked, shipped by rail across France, and loaded onto steamships crossing to England, America, and Japan. By 1914, it was the best-known French cheese on earth, made possible by a simple circle of thin wood. By August 1914, Camembert had become more than a food. It had become a symbol of France itself. When the First World War broke out and millions of French soldiers were mobilized for the Western Front, military supply planners chose Camembert as an official component of the army ration. Each soldier received a personal portion alongside his bread, wine, and tinned provisions, a deliberate decision by French military leadership to connect frontline fighters with the homeland they were defending. The trenches of the Somme, Verdun, and the Marne were fed on Camembert. French commanders understood something important that logistics officers rarely acknowledge. Food is morale, and nothing said France quite like Camembert from Normandy. The cultural impact of those 4 years was permanent and profound. Soldiers from every corner of France, from Brittany and Alsace, from Provence and the Pyrenees, who had never in their lives tasted Camembert before 1914, now ate it every day for 4 years in the worst conditions imaginable. When they came home in November 1918, they brought their appetite for it with them, and demand for Camembert exploded across every region of the country. Norman cheesemakers expanded their operations, hired more workers, raised larger herds, and built more production facilities. A single farmhouse cheese from a village of 200 people had been forged by a world war into the national cheese of France, a position of cultural dominance it would hold throughout the entire 20th century. By the 1950s and 1960s, the post-war success of Camembert had attracted a threat that no Norman farmer had anticipated. Large dairy corporations across France, and then across Germany, Denmark, and the United States, had realized that Camembert was the most recognized cheese name in the world, and that nothing in existing law prevented them from using it on anything they chose. They began manufacturing cheap, factory-made versions using pasteurized milk, commercially produced microbial cultures, and mechanical production systems that bore no resemblance whatsoever to the hand-ladled process Marie Harel had used in her farmhouse in 1791. These industrial copies carried the name, wore the white rind, and sat in the same circular boxes. Inside, they were a different product entirely, rubbery, flat, and without any of the complex biological character that made authentic Camembert worth eating. French consumers were being sold a hollow imitation of their own heritage, and most of them could not tell the difference. France's formal response came in 1983 with the creation of the Appellation d'Origine Contrôlée, the AOC, specifically for Camembert de Normandie. The rules were clear and strictly enforced. To legally use the designation Camembert de Normandie, a cheese had to be made from raw, unpasteurized milk sourced from Normand breed cattle raised exclusively in Normandy. It had to be hand-ladled into molds using the traditional 5-layer technique called moulage à la louche. It had to be matured under specific conditions for a minimum period. These were not guidelines, they were legally binding requirements overseen by the INAO, one of the most powerful food regulation bodies in Europe. It was a genuine and serious attempt to draw a permanent line between the real Camembert and every version that had ever imitated it. For a brief moment in 1983, it looked as though France had solved the problem for good. In 1992, just 9 years after the AOC designation was created, the European Union issued sweeping new food hygiene directives that threatened to undo everything the AOC had built. The EU's food safety mandate was straightforward: standardize food production across all member states to reduce the risk of foodborne illness. At the center of those directives was a push toward mandatory pasteurization of all soft-ripened cheeses, a category that included Camembert, Brie, Epoisse, Munster, and dozens of other iconic French products made by traditional methods. The scientific basis for concern was real. Listeria monocytogenes had been linked to several outbreaks involving raw milk soft cheese in Europe during the 1980s, and regulators were under genuine public pressure to respond. French health authorities, aligned with the EU framework, began seriously discussing regulatory changes that would amount to a complete prohibition of traditional raw milk production. These were not theoretical discussions. They were active legislative proposals backed by the institutional weight of both the French government and the European Commission in Brussels. The backlash from Norman cheesemakers and the French food establishment was immediate and fierce. Their argument was not that food safety didn't matter. It was that you cannot pasteurize Camembert de Normandie and call it the same product. Pasteurization kills the living microbial cultures responsible for the cheese's flavor, its aroma, its texture, and the specific biological complexity that makes it distinct from every other soft white cheese on Earth. The raw milk of Normand cows, shaped by the specific grass, soil, and climate of Normandy, carries a living microbial fingerprint that is permanently destroyed the moment it is heat-treated above 72 degrees Celsius. Authentic cheesemakers and food scientists argued clearly and publicly that mandating pasteurization was not food safety policy. It was the biological extinction of an irreplaceable living food product that had existed for over 2 centuries. France, for once, held firm. After years of intense political negotiation between Paris and Brussels, traditional raw milk cheeses with protected geographic designations were granted an exemption from the mandatory pasteurization directive. The AOC survived the 1990s intact, but the battle had revealed something important. The designation that was supposed to protect Camembert forever could be challenged, eroded, and renegotiated. Industrial dairy corporations had learned that lesson very carefully, and they had not finished fighting. By 2007, the corporate strategy had shifted from frontal attack to quiet legislative pressure, and it was working. The Lactalis Group, the single largest dairy corporation in France and one of the largest in the world, owner of the President brand, had been producing industrial pasteurized Camembert at enormous scale for decades. Their product dominated every supermarket shelf in France and across Europe. It was affordable, consistent, and shelf-stable. It also bore absolutely no legal right to call itself Camembert de Normandie. But Lactalis understood something that the small traditional producers did not yet fully appreciate. You do not need to change the product to destroy a designation. You only need to change the rules that define it. Their entry point was a concept called thermisation, a mild heat treatment applied to raw milk that sits below the legal temperature threshold for pasteurization. Thermised milk is not technically pasteurized, but the heat treatment reduces the microbial load of the milk significantly and, crucially, strips away many of the living organisms responsible for the complex, site-specific flavor profile of genuine Camembert de Normandie. Lactalis and affiliated industrial producers lobbied the INAO, the French body responsible for managing all AOC designations, to amend the Camembert de Normandie specification to allow thermised milk to qualify for the protected designation. If they succeeded, they would effectively be allowed to print Camembert de Normandie on a product that was biologically and philosophically distinct from what Marie Harel had created in 1791. The authentic producers, by 2007 numbering only 11 farms in all of Normandy, mounted fierce resistance. The INAO process stretched across years of hearings, reports, consultations, and competing scientific submissions, while the traditional sector continued to shrink. The decision came in 2018. After more than a decade of lobbying and negotiation, the INAO announced that the Camembert de Normandie AOP, AOC had been upgraded to AOP, the European equivalent, in 1996, would maintain its raw milk requirement. On paper, it was a victory. In practice, it was something far more complicated. The broader Camembert category remained unregulated, meaning that a product made in a factory in Brittany using pasteurized milk, mechanically cut curds, and commercially manufactured mold cultures could still be sold across France and Europe simply as Camembert. No geographic qualifier was required. No origin disclosure was mandatory. No production method had to be declared. The word Camembert, the most recognized cheese name in the world, built over 227 years of authentic craft, remained entirely available for any manufacturer anywhere to use without restriction. Before we get to the full weight of what this cost France, and why food historians argue this was one of the most consequential cultural decisions in modern French history, take a second right now and hit the like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who care about the real stories behind the food they eat. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. Every week, we go deeper into the hidden histories and forgotten secrets behind the world's greatest foods. Now let's talk about what France actually lost. The numbers tell the story more honestly than any argument can. In 1983, when France created the AOC designation for Camembert de Normandie, there were approximately 30 traditional raw milk producers actively making the genuine product in Normandy. By 2007, that number had fallen to 11. By 2022, fewer than 5 farms remained in operation producing genuine AOC Camembert de Normandie at commercial scale. In that same period, the genuine AOP product had fallen to just 6% of total Camembert sales across France. The other 94% of every Camembert sold in France, the country that invented it, protected it, fought for it at the EU level, and sent it to war with its soldiers, was industrial, pasteurized, and produced by methods that Marie Harel would not recognize as the same process at all. France had not simply failed to protect its heritage. It had presided over its near-total commercial replacement, while the laws that were supposed to prevent exactly that outcome remained technically on the books. The economic damage to Normandy's rural communities was real and measurable. The traditional Camembert industry had supported not just the handful of farm dairies producing the cheese directly, but the network of local suppliers around them. The Normand cattle breeders, whose specific breed was mandated by the AOC, the small salt suppliers, the poplar growers who produced the thin veneer for Ridel boxes, the regional distributors and affineurs who matured the cheese to peak condition. When that network contracted to the point of near extinction, the economic ripple effect across rural Normandy went well beyond cheese. Entire rural supply chains that had operated for generations were rendered commercially unviable by the simple fact that 94% of the market had moved to industrial production, which sourced its inputs through national and multinational supply chains that had nothing to do with Normandy at all. The hardest loss to quantify, and arguably the hardest to recover, is what food scientists call the microbial terroir of Camembert de Normandie. The raw, unpasteurized milk of Normand cows raised on the specific grasses and soils of the Pays d'Auge carries a microbial community that is entirely unique to that geography. That community of living bacteria, yeasts, and molds produces the specific enzyme activity responsible for the flavor compounds in authentic Camembert, the volatile sulfur compounds that give it its characteristic earthiness, the lipase activity that creates its buttery richness, the proteolytic enzymes that give its paste the texture that shifts from chalky and firm when young to almost liquid at the rind when fully ripe. That biological fingerprint cannot be recreated from a laboratory culture. It exists only because it has existed continuously in one place for over 2 centuries. Once the farms that carry it stop operating, the living culture breaks. It does not recover. It is the one thing about Camembert that money and regulation cannot restore once it is gone. The remaining producers are fighting, and they are fighting with some sophistication. Consumer awareness of AOP Camembert has grown significantly in the last 5 years, partly driven by food journalism and partly by a broader cultural shift among younger French consumers who are increasingly interested in provenance, artisan production, and the real stories behind what they eat. Specialty cheese retailers across France and in major export markets, particularly in the United Kingdom, Japan, and the United States, have expanded their AOP sections and are actively educating customers about the difference between a genuine Camembert de Normandie and an industrial substitute. There is genuine market demand for the authentic product among consumers who understand what they are buying. The problem is that at 6% market share, demand alone cannot sustain the infrastructure. Without active policy intervention, stricter labeling laws, mandatory origin disclosure for all products using the Camembert name, and meaningful financial support for the remaining traditional producers, the numbers continue to point in one direction only. France created this problem through accumulated institutional failure, not through any single catastrophic decision, but through decades of choosing the path of least regulatory resistance, each time industrial interests pushed back against the rules designed to protect genuine production. The 1983 AOC was the right instinct. The failure to enforce meaningful consumer labeling for generic Camembert The willingness to allow corporate producers to create parallel designations, like Fabriqué en Normandie, that implied geographic authenticity without legal standing. The decade-long INAO process that exhausted and financially drained small producers while large corporations operated without restriction. All of these were choices. They were made, over and over, in favor of industrial scale and against the thing they were supposed to be protecting. France will eventually calculate the full cost of those choices, and the number will be higher than any of the compromises that enabled them seemed to justify at the time. So here is where we land. In 1791, one woman in one village in Normandy created a cheese that fed French soldiers in the trenches of the First World War, charmed Napoleon III on a Paris railway platform, and became the most recognized French food product on earth. France spent a century building the legal architecture to protect that heritage, and then spent the following 4 decades allowing it to be hollowed out by corporate lobbying, regulatory inaction, and the simple arithmetic of supermarket shelf space. The genuine Camembert de Normandie, the raw milk, hand-ladled, biologically living product that Marie Harel invented in 1791, now holds just 6% of its own market. Less than 5 farms in all of Normandy still make it the way it was always made. That is not a market failure. That is a cultural catastrophe that was entirely preventable and almost entirely ignored. And the rest of the world is eating the replacement and calling it France. If this story hit differently than you expected, if you came in thinking this was going to be a cheese video and you're leaving with something that feels a lot bigger than that, that is exactly the kind of history we dig into on this channel every week. Hit the like button right now. It takes 1 second, and it makes a genuine difference to how many people this story reaches. Subscribe so you do not miss what we cover next. And drop a comment below. Did you know the difference between industrial Camembert and the real AOP product before watching this? Tell us in the comments. We read every single one.